it's my great pleasure today to have the opportunity to talk about language, poetry, the Bible with Sir Michael Edwards. My name is Stephen Lewis. I am a professor of English at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio, United States. And I also, in addition to teaching English, do a lot of translating of contemporary French authors, French thinkers. And it was in the course of that work that I had the opportunity to meet some of the work of Sir Michael Edwards, and then the even better fortune to start to correspond with him. And so I hope one day when this pandemic is over to meet him in person. But so far we've been corresponding and especially talking about a translation of one of his books that I've been undertaking, and that will be one of the focus points of our conversation today. So let me introduce Michael Edwards. He was born in 1938 near London, and he lives in France. He is a poet and a scholar of Shakespeare and Racine, among other writers, and he was educated at Christ's College of Cambridge University. He was professor at the Universities of Essex and Warwick from 1965 to 2002. And then in 2002, he became the first Briton elected to the Collège de France in the chair of literary creation in English. And he taught there from 2003 to 2008. In 2013, he became the first British person elected to the Académie Française, and in 2014 was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. Writing in both English and French, he has published over 25 books on literature, art, music, and over 17 books of poetry. And our conversation today will discuss, in particular, ideas from his 2016 book, Bible et poésie, as well as some poems from his 2019 volume in English, At the Brasserie Lipp. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you.
So in your book, Bible et poésie, you engage with a number of analogies. And I could say partial analogies, but that's actually all analogies about God are partial, says the fourth Lateran fourth Lateran. And so anyway, the God of the Bible creates through speech and sustains humanity in its relationship with him through speech. There's the example of the tablets of the law given to Moses on Sinai. There's the examples of the prophets. And yet, as you point out many times, God's speech is not our speech. Jesus, the Word of God, the very Word of God, spoke to men using human language. And he continues to do this through the Gospels, through the other writings of the New Testament, through the Old Testament also. And yet, at the same time, as you put it, the secret of God remains infinitely distant from our languages. So what are some ways in which poets you admire have approached this problematic relation between the divine and the human word? And how do you yourself approach this challenge as a poet and as a thinker?
I think most poets who have thought about that, and I thought about it quite a lot, would say that clearly God's language is different from our language, but that miraculously his language and ours meet in the Bible. The more I read the Bible, the more I realize that it is a quite wonderful book in the deepest sense of wonder. And that the real problem for us is that we no longer have Adam's language. Adam's language clearly is a response to God's. And one could think that the fact that humans speak, have the faculty of speech and can know the world through speech, was part of the creation of Adam in the image of God. God, who speaks the creation, then speaks Adam, and then gives Adam the invitation to name the animals. And Adam himself then takes the initiative to name the woman, and then after the fall to rename her as Eve. But our problem is that we do not have that Adamic language, which clearly is a means for Adam simply to discover the truth, whereas our language most of the time excludes us from Eden because it does not mesh perfectly with reality, with truth. But on the other hand, because we are humans in the image of God, our language has a relationship to that language which transcends our intelligence. I'm not going to tell you now what the relationship between our language and God's is, except that it does mean that when we use language, we are doing a divine thing, as it were, and this creates immense responsibility. Now, you asked me about the poets who have thought about that. I'm not sure that many have thought about it in those terms a great deal, but I think of Milton, for instance, who famously in Paradise Lost begins by asking the Holy Spirit to help him create his poem, and even goes so far as to ask that the same Spirit who moved on the face of the deep and on the darkness at the beginning of Genesis would move over his darkness, his sin, and create out of him, nevertheless, a poem justifying the ways of God to men, as at the beginning the Spirit moving is part of the creation of the universe out of darkness. And that seems to be perfectly justified, that a Christian poet should pray to God. All our poems can be God-inspired, as it were, in inverted commas and with all sorts of conditionals, because any of our acts can be God-inspired, any of our acts can issue from prayer. And we know that the poems that we write are going to be like all the actions that we do after prayer, all the things that we say after prayer, they're going to be partly okay and partly the responsibility of the sin in us. So Milton, having done that, seems to me to realize that what is actually happening when he's writing is that something indeed intervenes, that am I going on too long? I mean,
no, this is good. Go ahead, I'll cut you off.
You'll tell me. He seems to realize that what is happening is indeed that the poem, at its best moments probably, is in a sense being given to him. He begins to, I was going to say to write, he begins to compose in his head, and things occur, and he realizes that the things that are occurring come from elsewhere, but he can't really say it's the Spirit giving me that, because this is unchristian. So he invents Urania, or rather he uses Urania, the muse of celestial poetry. And when he turns to a Urania, that seems to be exactly the right turn of a Christian. And another poet who clearly thought about this in a quite different way would be Donne, another poet whom I read and reread and reread.
Yes.
Donne in the 19th expostulation says, speaking to God and thinking about the Bible, my God, my God, you are in a way a direct God, a literal God. You say things plainly so that we can understand them. But then he moves on to what obviously interests him far more, because he's not himself a poet of the plain style. He then says, but you are also a figurative God. And he talks about, in the Bible, heights of figures and curtains of allegories, such peregrinations to fetch remote and precious metaphors, such third heavens of hyperboles. I love that last expression, third heavens of hyperboles, which is mixing not only the Bible, of course, it's a biblical expression, with a word out of the rhetorical tradition, hyperbole, but it's also mixing a superhuman or a transhuman experience, that of the person Paul's referring to, who may be himself, who is caught up into the third heaven, with writing. That seems to be very bold and actually very true.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
yes? Sorry.
Well, yeah. How about for yourself as a poet? I mean, I know that we're going to have a chance probably to hear you read a poem, but how do you think about your own writing in relation to this question?
What I think, first of all, is that all writing is an immense responsibility, because language is obviously a gift. It's not something that we've simply created out of original grunts and pointing. It's a gift of God. And our responsibility, if we're writers, and I'd add especially if we're poets, but then that's because I'm a poet, I would, wouldn't I? Our responsibility is to write not like God and the biblical writers, we can't do that, but at the best we can, using all the resources of the language that God has given us. And it seems to me that one of the ways of responding to God's perfect language, and to the, on the one hand, clear, plain sense when he says things like, be still and know that I am God. And on the other hand, the third heavens of hyperboles in Ezekiel and Isaiah and so on, is precisely to delight in God, in language, in the way that Donne does. And so this comes to me. I mean, it's not a question of deciding to delight in language. You can't. Right. I think any poet is a poet because he delights in language, and because above all, he hears language. He doesn't write poetry. He hears poetry in his head, and of course he writes it because he's got to do so to remember it. And a reader doesn't read poetry. He hears the poetry that is going on in his head, even if he's reading silently. Mm-hmm. So delighting seems to be the essential thing, and picking up all sorts of hints from scripture. For instance, one thing that struck me from the beginning, as soon as I became a Christian and started sort of reading what people said about Christianity, because I didn't know Hebrew, is that the Bible is absolutely full of puns. Uh-huh. And this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because, you know, pun is a sort of a rather low kind of figure of speech. Like hyperbole, for instance, whereas in fact the biblical writers delight in language to the point that they're always playing with it. The woman is created out of man, because Adam can say Isha and Ish, and the same with Eve. She is the mother of all living, and Eve and living actually work in English as well. Ève et tous les vivants in French likewise. Mm-hmm. That's one thing, just using language in a way that plays with words continually, not necessarily by punning, but by making sure that words talk to each other in a poem in the way that they don't in normal language. And then another thing for me in particular, being an English poet, at least when I'm writing poetry in English, is that the delight in English leads me to want always to go down into the roots. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very clear in At the Brasserie Lipp.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm glad. I think it's wonderful for an English poet to be using a language which is partly Germanic, well, it's basically Germanic, but has a great deal of Latin words as well. Mm-hmm. So that at one and the same time, you can, by using those words knowingly, you can go back through the millennia to pick up their roots. And you can also play between the two effects of the Germanic words in English and the Latinate words in English. The effects are quite different, it seems to me, and several poets have my computer has suddenly started dancing with delight. Several poets have actually played between the two, and I like to play between the two as well.
Yeah, Hopkins, right? The grandeur of God, and that, you know, the use of that French word, really.
Yes. Oh, I think Hopkins is a great poet for me, in part, I mean, apart from all the other reasons, his understanding of Christianity and so on, partly because he was very much into Anglo-Saxon, clearly,
yeah,
very much into the Germanic base of our language. And in fact, his sprung rhythm is clearly based on the Anglo-Saxon sense of the stress, which is still with us, it seems to me. And
yeah. Well, and that's why it's so interesting when he uses such a non-Germanic word, you know, in a prominent place.
Whereas God, of course, is entirely English, as the
Yeah.
Lord is English.
Yeah.
And I discovered only a few years ago that the word Lord is actually uniquely English. It isn't found in any other Germanic language. Lord and Lady are uniquely ours.
Huh. Wonderful. Well, that kind of leads me to my second question, which has to do with this very interesting notion that you have in Bible et Poésie about the poem, but also all works of art being a kind of body. And I mean, in what you were just talking about, I was, of course, thinking about the fact that you write in English as well as French, and yet you're the same body. And so thinking about, anyway, the poems as in this bodily sense, and in some way connected to the incarnate, the carnal fact of the poet. But anyway, so you talk in the book about, as I said, all artworks and poems in particular being a kind of body, and you say that they are, in a sense, a kind of sketch or outline of a glorious body or a spiritual body, making reference there to letters of St. Paul. So it's again an analogy where you're making a comparison, but then immediately saying, and yet all of our poems are very different from any poems that occur in Scripture. And of course, the glorious body is not the same as the kind of sketch of a spiritual body. So I have two questions about that. One is just to explain it a little bit more. But the second, which I'm very curious to hear about, is how did it occur to you to make this connection? Because I have never, and maybe it's been made before, but I've never come across it before. So
a poem is a body to me, in the sense that first of all, it is a form. It has, as it were, an outline. It has volume as well. But more than that, it makes sounds, and it breathes, and it has rhythm as you read it. I'm thinking of the poem as spoken, of course. It has a mind with all manner of thoughts in it, going around and moving together in the way that in normal speech ideas don't, the poem being so concentrated. And it has memories, just as we have memories in our bodies. It has memories which are longer than ours, in fact. Memories longer than ours, because the simple memories of the individual words go back hundreds of years, indeed millennia. And then they remember the way in which they've been used in the past, the way in which, for instance, other writers, other poets have used them, or indeed the way in which they've been used in translations of the Bible. So that there's a whole hinterland of memory in a poem, and there's this thought. And it seems the analogy may be a bit pushed, but I hope not. That that in the same way that the universe is a material body full of mind, of logos, let's say, because God has actually created it. It's even full of speech, because God made it out of speech, and it's even full of speech figuratively, literally, in the sense that that all nature praises God. And so the universe is a kind of body with a mind. We're clearly a body with a mind, and it seems to me that a poem also is a body with a mind, much more than any other form of literature, of writing. And that just seems to me very important, because when we write about a poem, we do move into another world, as it were. It strikes me very much in thinking about painting, for instance, where it's almost easier to say what I mean. In poetry, of course, you're using language, and I'm using language to explain language. Whereas in a painting, when you look at a tree of Constable, for instance, or a tree in an Abaltus painting, you're not looking at a tree. And the first reaction is, well, it's less than a tree. I mean, it can't shade, doesn't shade you, it doesn't give you flowers and fruit and so on. It doesn't have that presence, real presence, as it were, of a tree. But in another sense, it's more than a tree, because it's a tree that has been seen differently by painters who have different eyes from ours and see better. And therefore, it's a tree that is not a spiritual tree, of course. It's not a tree that's been recreated. It's not a tree from the new earth, but it's on the way, as it were. It's our way of saying, well, this is what we can do. We cannot imagine even what a glorious body is that we will have in heaven, or a spiritual body. We cannot even imagine it, let alone describe it. But we can get to the point where we're, as it were, showing that the world already has an otherness. And it seems to me that this actually is why we've been given art, all the arts. I mean, all the arts, across to architecture, photography, dance, opera, and so on. In fact, dance is, come to think of it, a very good example, because when you see dancers, and especially trained ballet dancers, you do have the sense that their bodies are not quite ours. They can do things with their bodies that you shouldn't be allowed to do.
Yes.
And above all, their bodies become aerial. They don't float, of course, there's nothing supernatural happening, but there's a sense of an aerial body, which is not a spiritual body, but which gives one a sense that within the world itself, there are all these hints of something else. And I think this is what all artists sense in one way or another, whether they're Christians or not. And that this is, in a way, one way of redeeming time. What interests me in this whole idea is that one is told to redeem time, and we don't know what that expression means, except we do see that the word for redeeming there is the same as he used of Jesus redeeming us, redeeming humanity. It's very strange, in fact. It's one of those expressions of Paul, which he comes back to, which we do not ultimately understand. But one way of redeeming time, it seems to me, is to continually see in the creation, not the recreation, but the possibility After all, Paul does say, as everyone knows, that the whole creation groans in travail until this day. And it's groaning in travail. It's like a pregnant woman
Yes.
wanting desperately to bring out the new heaven and the new earth. And that expression of the new heavens and the new earth has been with me since I became a Christian, actually, very shortly after I came across it. And it seems to me an immense light, very clear light thrown on all artistic effort, that all art, in a way, is an awareness that the earth is unfinished, that there is something else. And you can't make that something else, but you can create otherness in poems, in plays, in paintings, in drawings, in photographs, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. So there's always this eschatological hint in everything, in every work of art, in the activity of the artist. That's fascinating.
I think so.
Yeah.
Your second question was, where did I get the idea from? And
Yeah,
I actually think I got it from thinking about poetry and other arts as recreation, quite simply. How are they recreation? Well, what is this strange thing that is a picture on the wall, which seems to be a picture of a haywain, or a picture in Chardin of a few objects on a stone table and so on. It's not any of that. It's a picture on a wall and has no dimensions other than two, but it's more than that. We know that. I mean, it's a sort of ABC of art appreciation. But where do we go from that original intuition, which is obvious? Where do we go from the cliche? And I think we go from there to thinking that we are in the business of looking beyond the world, finding otherness in the world. And it's a way of, I think, living poetically or living artistically. I'm continually aware, for instance, that poetry is actually there in the world. It's there in the garden behind me. I don't know if you can see it. There are all sorts of hints in the way in which light strikes an orchard that is just visible through a gap in the trees and so on, especially in the evening. It's a sort of an otherness beyond the garden. It's rather like in 17th century Dutch interiors, where you're in one room and there's very often an open door to another room. And why is the other room there? It's a sort of otherness. And it seems to me that a poem is a sort of threshold onto otherness. It's not, of course, heaven that you're showing. We're incapable of doing so. But you show that there is an otherness in the world. My daughter, who is a painter, says, for instance, that when she's walking, she notices the long shadows in the evening of trees across a path. And she says, they draw the landscape, which I think is a nice expression. It's not one I would have used, not being a painter and having absolutely no talent in that direction. But she sees the shadows painting the landscape. In other words, she too is, I think, redeeming the time with her eyes, and then she will redeem it further in a painting in which she shows that and shows that it's actually rather numinous.
Yeah, well, that's
the world itself is numinous.
Yeah, the way you're describing it, it extends out to all work, really, all living, and yet is especially concentrated and detectable in the artwork, in the poem. I had a question to ask you about. There's this French poet that I imagine you probably even know him, but Jean-Pierre Lemaire, who has some very interesting reflections on his poetry in relation to the Bible. But one of the things that he wrote, and I shared with you earlier, was the following. He said, a poem inspired by a passage from the Old or New Testament is not born from the Bible alone, but from a back and forth movement between the biblical word and another pole, which generally we shall call life. And so this kind of shuttling between the biblical world and life, I think a lot of, I mean, this is his term, his way of talking about this, not yours, but I think a lot of what you've been saying resonates with that. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit and maybe even read for us a poem where you are engaging specifically with some words from Scripture to kind of show us how in some of your own work what this looks like, what you've been describing, what it looks like.
Yes. I think all poems come from life. And incidentally, I do know Jean-Pierre Lemaire and greatly like him, and I think he's a very, very fine poet. All poems come from life, I'm sure of that. My poems in relation to the Bible, well, there are all sorts of relations, in fact. One relation which interests me, because it's part of a thing that interests me in any case, is that I know that I have poems where certain words, phrases from the Bible intervene, as it were, have intervened by themselves, without my thinking that I was going to use them. You know, I'm in the middle of composing a poem, and bang, something comes to mind, and it actually is a biblical passage, and it's just what I need in the poem. I'm interested in that because it seems to me that so very often what is good in any poem, if there is anything good in my poems, came, and that I can even, looking back on the poem, think that's really rather good, without being vain and without self-congratulation, because I'm simply saying, yeah, that came just at the right moment. I wonder where from, whoever wrote that was very good. That's one thing, and I'm very pleased when that happens, because it enables me, once it's there, then to think about other things. I mean, I have a poem in Lipp, for instance, I seem to remember, where all of a sudden, there's a biblical quotation which then works perfectly with a reference to Caliban, which is, one might have thought, at the other end of the spectrum. Another way is that from time to time, not very often, I write poems actually thinking about the fact that certain words in English translations of the Bible, and in particular the King James Version, are really rather fine and possibly difficult to see in any other language. The word righteousness, for instance, it's not much used now, except by people who read the King James Version, but righteousness, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled, satisfied. In translations into the Romance languages, you always get, as far as I know, a later version of Justitia. Justice in French, Justitia, Judicia, and so on. And justice, or justice in English, doesn't seem to me to make it. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after justice. Well, you might see a prisoner who's innocent and he's hungry and thirsty. There's something
contractual or going on with justice that's not there.
Yeah. Whereas righteousness is extraordinarily powerful. It's a Germanic word, of course. We're back to the Anglo-Saxons. And others, I suppose, meditate in different ways. Perhaps I could, in fact, read one such poem, or
yeah, that would be great.
Me too, so why not?
Yes.
There's certainly one where I'm meditating on a line of scripture, and and going a lot further than that. I don't like writing poems which are simply on one thing. You've probably noticed.
Yes.
I very much like poems which are moving about. I'm much closer to a metaphysical than to Tennyson. And so, to say, hallowed be thy name is like speaking in tongues. Name has a meaning deep in some foreign language, hallowed, echoing with the awestruck gladness of the old Saxons who invade us still, is still absorbingly unknowable. Father, keep aloof, be sanctified, effulgent in glory, beyond our grasp, yet to windward whence the Spirit blows, and rinse our ears to hear alone in our secret closet, and having shut the door, the deafening chorus of creatures out of reach, above and below our dumb selves. Heaven alive with the hailing dead, seas that roar, mountains shouting, rivers clapping their hands to acclaim. Admit me to your law house. Show me the fields shining with praise, the sun exalting, a single tree itself singing.
Beautiful.
I was obviously interested in the fact that, sorry?
I said beautiful. Thank you very much.
I was obviously interested in the fact that as soon as you enter the Lord's Prayer, you are stunned in all sorts of ways by saying our God rather than my God. I mean, Jesus tells us to go into our closet and shut the door, and you imagine that you're all alone, and then you say our. In other words, all the church is praying with you, and then you say Father, which is a sudden the descent of God as a father to us, and then you say which art in heaven. So God, as it were, goes back to heaven, and there's a sort of vertiginous movement, which is absolutely fabulous. It's a great poem, incidentally, the Lord's Prayer. I mean, it's perhaps the greatest of all poems. But I was struck then that you move on to hallowed be your name. And even if you translate that into Latin and say sanctified be your name, or may your name be sanctified, you're obviously dealing with words that you don't really understand. And hallowed, of course, struck me because it is a Saxon word. It's a word that Hopkins come back to, him whom we both like greatly. Hopkins talks about All Hallows, of course, the hallows in heaven. And it means the saints, but it has a sort of aura about it, which shows that God is actually other. Our prime desire in living should be that God's name be hallowed, but we don't quite understand what hallowed means, except that obviously everything from the blessed in heaven down to the fire and frost and rain and snow, Psalm 148, should be praising God continuously. And then even the word name, which the Old Testament teaches us, is a very strange word. We've got used to being familiar with it. What's your name and so on. But the name of God is very mysterious, so that the Jews would not pronounce it. And there are all sorts of references in the Old Testament to the name of God, the blessed name of God. Why the name of God rather than simply blessed God? And then since I've used a Saxon word, naturally I go into the awestruck gladness of the old Saxons who invade us still, realizing that the Saxons are still in our language, especially in our poetry. And it's a poem assuming that even when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we're not quite as eloquent as the creation, which is praising God out of its exuberance without the burden of sin. We praise God knowing that we're sinners and that we're still sinners, whereas the universe and obviously the blessed in heaven praise God very enviably.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck also at the end of the poem by "Admit me to your lore house. Show me the fields shining with praise, the sun exalting, a single tree itself singing." That seems to, mentioning of the tree and the what you were saying about your daughter's experience of the landscape or the paintings of a tree. What about this idea of the lore house? It resonates for me with some of what you've said about the memory contained in language. It also sounds like a translation from a Old English poem.
It isn't, of course.
What were you thinking about there?
Yes, incidentally, your American English brings out the difference between L-O-R-E, lore house, and L-A-W, which my English doesn't.
Yes,
in British English, I have to say your law house. And as I read it, I thought, people are going to think law, as in law, the heavy hand of the law. L-O-R-E, yes. The law house, I think, is, at least I don't think it's a translation of an Anglo-Saxon expression. It might be, actually. I need to look at my notes. But it's that sense that there is a kind of holy learning in the Bible, which is the lore of God. It's his teaching, and law in uses which are no longer quite modern English, as you know, means both the content of the teaching and the fact of teaching. It's active, as everything in the Bible. It's like truth in the Bible. Truth isn't a concept as it is for Westerners and Americans and so on. Truth is something you do, which I think is fascinating. It cuts across so many of our ways of thinking. And I see that law house as the treasure of God's teaching, and all the treasures, including what those wonderful Anglo-Saxons called the word hoard. I think that word for the vocabulary of a tongue, of a language, is absolutely marvelous. It's the treasure from which you extract words. And in fact, in Widsith, isn't it, the Anglo-Saxon poem, he actually begins by drawing words from the hoard. It's lovely. I think that's what a poet does. That's part of the delighting, Gosh, there's the word hallowed that you can use in a poem and so on.
Yes.
Yeah. And the tree at the end, yes, I suppose I often refer to trees because it does seem to me that the tree is a rather beautiful image. It's Virgil uses it, of course, as an image of man, whose roots go down into the earth for life, but whose branches reach up to another world. As we are rooted in earth, quite rightly, creatures of the earth is what we're meant to be. But at the same time, we have the sense that we ought to reach upwards to something else. We would do God.
Would you be willing to read one more, perhaps the last poem in the book, or the next to last one, actually? Him hanging against the sky.
Yes, this is thinking about a relation to the Bible, which is different, of course.
Yes, right.
Fine, right. Yes. Him hanging against the sky, he remembered between two thieves, intermittently, and writing recalled the unfinished vision. He was numbered with the transgressors. Startled, I imagine, Matthew, and exultant, as he repeated newly the unforgotten find. Unceasingly, the New Testament casts line after line into its memory, the ode, leaving nothing unchanged. The act of memory changes. Memory, like photography, is not a realist art. Today's light plays on each recovered scene as sunlight each day, on each day's various faces. Memory is the name for the unknown occasional country where among the looming half-foreign me's, the signs of the real and waiting other me fitfully glint, the garden lilac, a Kingston street, appear sometimes, numinous, new worldly. I present Matthew, of course, as doing what a human writer does, because presumably we can assume that the writers of the Bible actually wrote as writers. They didn't sit down and wait for inspiration to fall. They actually got on with the job of writing. And when considerably after the event of the crucifixion, he writes about the crucifixion. He, perhaps in the act of writing, I don't know, suddenly remembers Isaiah 53, saying that the suffering servant will be numbered with the transgressors. And he sees that that's the point. And he is therefore, I think, probably startled like any other writer. I'm treating him rather as a poet, but then he's such a good writer that he could have become a poet. My novelist friends, please don't listen from now on. He's startled and exultant because he repeats what I call he repeats newly the unforgotten find, which is a deliberate and rather complex oxymoron in the tradition of Donne, I suppose. I wasn't thinking of Donne. The verse is unforgotten because devout Jews heard it or read it. It wasn't. It was available, but it was a find because no one had applied it to the Messiah, to Jesus, the true Messiah, and he repeats it newly. He's not saying that what was said in the Old Testament was wrong. He's saying that the interpretation that has been given so far was inadequate. Correct, but inadequate. Now, this is the real interpretation. So he's doing, it seems to me, what memory does, because I go on then to think more generally about memory in writing poetry. That memory too is creative. It doesn't simply dredge up a fact from the past and shove it into the present or into a poem. By remembering the past, it slightly or greatly transforms it. Not because there's an error, of course there can be an error, you can remember incorrectly, but because by remembering even with exactness, you change it because you're a different person. In a poem, you've put that memory in a context, and the context is quite different from the context in which the memory occurred. And so it changes. And this seems to me absolutely essential, because everything I've been saying really about poetry is that what it does is it changes. Adam named the world, and I take it this means that he saw exactly what the animals were, and he gave them a name which was at once true to their nature and true to his nature. Sorry, I keep knocking the computer.
Well, thank you for that. I in speaking with you and listening to you, I'm just so struck by the ways in which so many things that we, I think, have a tendency to understand as static, as sort of one-sided in the sense that there is you know, a memory and we draw on it to use it, or there are the words of the Bible and we read them and then somehow you know, put them into action in some way, or these kinds of very simplistic and yeah, one-sided viewpoints, as if everything is in our action. What I'm just so struck by is how you know, your account of memory, or your account of the use of language in really any dimension is so dynamic. We're being given something at every step, so that so that we're really implicated in the work of someone else, of something is being done through us that we're participating in. We don't initiate, really. We so often think we do, but thank you so much for this conversation. I've really feel like I've learned a lot. I'm going to go back to my work on Bible et poésie and with some further and new insights. And I think also what you've said is going to be very valuable for the work of this festival. The kind of, one of the things that's interesting about this festival, whether we do it in person or we do it, you know, in this very unusual way with Zoom calls and things like that, is that each of the individual events starts to shine a light on the others in new ways, and something kind of builds in a way that you could have never imagined. So thank you very, very much for participating and speaking to us.
Thank you for speaking to me. It's good to have seen you.
Yes, very good. Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to this second session of the 2020 Festival of Friendships conversation with poets about language, poetry, and Christian experience. My name is Stephen Lewis. After speaking in our first segment with the scholar and poet Sir Michael Edwards, it is now my great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with two American poets whose poetry I value a great deal and whose friendship I value a great deal: Ewa Chrusciel and Steve Kramp. So allow me to say a few words of introduction for each of them before we get underway. Ewa Chrusciel is a poet, teacher, and translator working as an associate professor of humanities at Colby Sawyer College in New London, New Hampshire. She has published 8 books, including 6 books of poetry. 3 of those books of poetry are poetry in English, and I'll mention them in reverse order of their publication. So the most recent first. The most recent is called Of Annunciations. It was published in 2017 by Omni Dawn. Her second book of poetry in English is called Contraband of Hoopoe, 2014. And the first of her books in English of poetry is entitled Strata, and that was published in 2009 and then reprinted in 2018 by Omni Dawn again. She's also written and published 3 books of poetry in Polish. The titles, which hopefully I will pronounce correctly: Tobołek, Sopiki, and Furkot. Is that correct, Ewa? Yes, I think so. Okay. Contraband of Hoopoe has been translated into Italian. And one of her poems from her book Of Annunciation, the 2017 volume, entitled Exilium, was nominated for the Pushcart Prize. Ewa Chrusciel has given a number of readings from her most recent book all over the place, including at Cairo University in Cairo, Egypt. She read in Jerusalem, and then a number of places in the United States, in San Francisco, New York, several places in New Hampshire and Vermont, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She has published with co-translator Miłosz Bierdzycki, a Polish translation of selected poems by Jory Graham. And she's also translated into Polish books by Jack London, Joseph Conrad, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and some poems, various poems by Kazim Ali, Lynn Hagenian, Cole Swenson, and some other American poets. Stephen Kramp holds a master's in theology from the Franciscan University of Steubenville and a master's in fine arts in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop at Iowa University. Prior to his current position as humanities chair at the John Paul the Great Catholic University, he taught at the University of California in Merced and at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. He has published a chapbook of poems entitled Good Friday, a Lenten Ode, and he has a wonderful new manuscript entitled Fetus. He lives in the mountains northeast of San Diego with his family. So welcome, Ewa and Steve. It's wonderful to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. So to start off, the title of this 2020 Festival of Friendship is You Will Be Found. And one of the first, for me personally, one of the first poetic associations I made when I heard that title was to a line near the end of one of Seamus Heaney's poems called Casualty. The speaker is recalling an experience of being out on the water with the fisherman who's the main character of the poem. And he writes this: "That morning, when he took me in his boat, the screw purling, turning indolent fathoms white, I tasted freedom with him. To get out early, haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch and smile, as you find a rhythm working you, slow mile by mile, into your proper haunt." And it's particularly those last couple lines about finding a rhythm that basically finds you, in a sense. The rhythm is working you as a kind of, I think in that poem, it figures inspiration in a certain way. And so the question I wanted to ask you has to do with this concept of inspiration. Is it a concept that helps you to understand what you're doing when you write poetry? Maybe another way to get at it could be, what do you find given to you when you're writing? And why is it important as a poet to notice the givenness that's involved in poems?
Well, for me, the thing that I come back to with this idea of inspiration, and we've talked about it a bit, Stephen, but I've guess grown in my understanding of inspiration, or I've just kind of come to a new understanding of inspiration that really challenged my whole way of working in poetry. And when I was younger, the idea of being inspired basically meant that I had energy, that I was productive, that I was just generative. And so I guess as I think about inspiration now, I think about inspiration in terms of freedom, but not always in terms of a freedom to transcend myself or to become something other than I've been. But I think of inspiration as being more purely who I am. And so when we talk about Seamus Heaney right there, the idea that like for me, I would have always seen inspiration as being kind of going against the constraints of form, right? And inspiration would be kind of like bucking against that somehow, chafing against it. And so as I've come to understand inspiration differently, not as an attainment of a wild liberty, but of the freedom to return to who I truly am, the freedom of a return to childhood, that divine childhood. That for me has meant that I embrace those constraints, that I accept them. I don't necessarily enjoy them. I don't say, hey, cool, give me some sort of formal matrix and let me kind of like maneuver my way through it in my inevitably clumsy way. But there's something about it to me that's beautiful, because that way poetry doesn't become about a grandiosity of the self, but it becomes about a truth of the self, if that makes sense. So that's just kind of my first thought. And Eva, I'll turn it over to you, and then maybe we can bounce it back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's really inspiring. Gives me a lot of inspiration what you said. But so I wanted to say that actually the idea of inspiration or epiphany has been with me for a long time, even academically speaking, because part of my PhD dissertation was on recuperation of epiphany in postmodern poetics. So actually I found a lot of knowledge in reading like books like Sources of the Self by Taylor.
Mm.
If I remember the title well.
Yeah.
And the shift, from exterior grace and it was just sort of academic approach, but I have to say the origin of poetry for me was this moment of you are struck by an orange or whatever it is, by a green lizard or by a hummingbird. And actually starting from high school, when I basically only wrote in Polish, these were these moments that would take forgive me the word, possession of me. Whether it was a voice that needed to come out. And actually I wanted to quote Czesław Miłosz, a Polish poet, who in his poem Ars Poetica says that there is this indecent thing in poetry. We don't know where it comes from, but it's like a tiger that jumps out of you. And we can only hope that a good spirit will be speaking through us. Therefore, we have to be careful when we write poetry and actually, don't just generate poetry. That's what you, Steve, were saying, but actually be, how to say it, thoughtful or considerate. And Miłosz, actually I wrote it down somewhere, Miłosz claimed that in that poem, actually he says, poetry is rightly said to be dictated by a daimonion. It's this idea of inspiration, but we said we don't really know whether it's a good angel or not, and we have to hope, in a sense, pray that we are given, we open the room of ourselves to a good voice. So that always, sort of made me think, and that idea of necessity, the inspiration is necessity, whether it's a psychological moment, a moment of suffering. I actually find suffering very precious for, the life of a writer. And another poet that inspired me when I was still in Poland was Paul Celan, who actually claimed that poets are very wounded people, and that poets are so wounded by reality that they seek to recreate or seek another type of reality. Not, I don't understand it per escape, mm-hmm. But maybe recuperation of reality, or going, so this understanding of sustaining or keeping your wound open is also something that I link with inspiration, right? But this idea of a tiger jumping out has been always with me, except also it becomes complicated when you write in non-native language. So then the whole idea had to be rethought and reconsidered, because then those moments of rapture, the moments of necessity, whether they came from some dolor or from joy that I experienced as a beginner, as a writer who just initiated writing, became complicated. Those moments sometimes just don't show up, they are chiseled, or there is you know, in a foreign language, you can't take anything for granted in a sense. So sometimes you get lost, you know, where is my inspiration, right? But the inspiration is still there, and it is just an interesting relationship. Like I can think of Elizabeth Bishop, who was asked once in an interview for Paris Review, forget what year was it, but whether there was one poem that arrived suddenly, and she said one art, the art of losing. But that poem took 17 drafts and 2 weeks, and was diametrically different, right? The final version from the first version. And so I think when you write in a non-native language, sometimes you forget that the inspiration or a miracle of writing is still there, but it's just a very very, you know, arduous kind of, yeah. And I actually thought I would read another poem, but that actually comes to my mind because often my inspiration when I was starting to write in Polish were actually paintings of Annunciations. I would go to a museum, so they were ekphrastic moments too, right? So indirect, actually, moments of inspiration, indirect epiphanies. And actually, one of my newest poems, if you allow me,
Yeah,
Stephen, I can read it. Talks about this arduous road where sometimes we wonder what really inspiration is. But it's a relationship of work and maybe road and miracle, or work and inspiration. And it's based on Jan van Eyck's Annunciation. I might be mispronouncing his name, a Dutch painter from the Ghent altarpiece. After Jan van Eyck's Annunciation, in the space between Mary and the angel, there is a still life, a linen cloth. The flax plant is violet, blue, or white. It blooms only one day. Then it must be uprooted and spread out on the field exposed to rain and dew. It takes days for flax to be servile, to convert into fiber. Then hours and days and years of spinning, so many threads that nothing looks like a miracle, but a worker's yes. Her hackling, scorching, and then continuous tapping of her foot. One cloth from multitudes of fibers aligned.
Thank you. Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you.
What were the multitudes of fibers you were thinking of there at the end? Obviously, there are lots of different things that could be in there.
Right. I think I will imagine the worker, you know, with spinning and creating cloth from a plant, you know, from flax. And that the fibers have to be constantly converted into this one precious, you know, one that will contribute to the cloth. So,
yeah, just as
so it's, we could extrapolate it maybe into chiseling of one line or a poem or a manuscript, but also I think I was particularly thinking about language and being non-native. That's why that poem came to me.
Steve, what were you going to say in relation to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been thinking about this as Eva's been talking, because, and I've been thinking about it in relation to some of what Sir Michael had been talking about in the segment that you recorded with him, Stephen. And I don't think these things are really at odds necessarily. In Sir Michael's talk, he was talking about the poet delighting in the world, right, and finding the poetry that is not only abundant but is everywhere, right? Poetry is kind of omnipresent. It just waits to be discovered, to be teased out through this loving act of play with language. that the poet takes on. And I say play, but obviously it's a sacred kind of play. But as I was listening to him, I was thinking, like I talked about how some of my conceptions of these things have changed over time. And for me, I am overwhelmed at points, not just by my own inadequacy for that, because I mean, that's not like a false modesty, but I think we would all feel that way, talking about, we have this broken human language that's in no way adequate to even capture the created world around us, much less approximate some sort of Adamic or divine speech. So, but I'm profoundly aware of the fact that I, as a poet, am broken, and I'm very much taking up the cross of poetry, and in a weakened, battered, even bloodied state, I'm trying to make my way toward a place of exaltation that might coincide with a place of greatest suffering and greatest loss, as Eva was talking about. But there's that sense that, like, we're ruined, right? We're in a fallen world, and I'm not just saying that for some sort of rhetorical effect. Like, that's very much our state, and the only reason we don't see it is because we're blind. We don't have the spiritual gaze with which to see that ruination that we're in, and that we then, in some ways, add to, but with love through our poetry. So I was thinking about that when she was talking, Eva, when you were talking about those moments of seeing the greenness of the lizard or the orange, and being kind of just so focused on it, being kind of wrapped by some sort of sensory experience or some perception of the world, something that you were living through, or some language that you'd come across. Because in the end, as inspiring as that moment might be, inspiring in kind of a loose sense, right? It makes you want to try to capture beauty somehow with language. But we always fall short, right? There was no time when you actually captured the lizard. There was no time when the orange was as orange in your poem. Now, there's beauty in the effort, but it's also going to be, there's like that failure kind of woven into it. So when I talk about these things, I don't think they're irreconcilable. I think that vision of the beauty of the world and this delight that the poet can take in language, I think it actually meshes with what I'm talking about, but it complicates it a little bit. And it almost, I don't know, maybe it nudges the poet in the direction of acknowledging that poetry is essentially a spiritual expression. It is that combination of joy and suffering, and the desire to reconcile all of this together in a single moment, using these broken implements that we have. So I don't know if that gets you thinking about anything, Eva, or.
Yeah, well, let me say something, because that's getting us into another question that I had talked with you guys about, and that is, I think, the way in which poetic making for you has to do with your Christian experience. And I think, Steve, you're starting to articulate that. And yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, Sir Michael was talking about, or he likes to go just by Michael, so we can just say Michael. He was talking about, in addition to, at the same time that there is that clear fall from Adamic language, that we don't say things in anywhere approximating, like our words don't have that connection to things in the way that Adam did in the naming of the animals, which there's a great title by this philosopher that I like quite a bit, Jean-Louis Chrétien, and he wrote a book called The Arc of Speech, because in certain patristic thinkers, they talk about Adam's naming of the animals as the first arc, which I think is really beautiful, the arc of speech. But one thing he was saying was that there is this ongoing redeeming of the time that's happening. God is operating. He is, we are moving toward parousia through the cross, exactly as you said. And, his way of conceiving of artworks is that they give a foretaste of this, or they, at their best, they sort of participate in some way in this becoming that's happening, at least when there's something truly beautiful. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of remind us of that, and then see if you know, where you guys wanted to go next with some of these issues. Maybe Eva, looks like you want to say something, so go ahead.
And this, yes, and I still what Steve said resonates with me, because when you, Steve, and hopefully I'll manage to shift, you know, to your question, Stephen.
Sure.
But what you were saying about that insufficiency of language actually was at the core of Czesław Miłosz writing, and there is this beautiful prose poem Esse, in which, you know, the poet, actually, we know it's a poet, is in the metro station in Paris, and he sees a face and has this sort of, in a maybe Levinas sense, this epiphany of face, but also suffering, because he cannot understand the mystery of being. And the poem actually ends, it's one of my favorite poems, and it's not about having, you know, it's not even about a desire, right? It's just this, you know, realization that he's a writer, and that he fails to name the world, and that in the end he can only say she is, I am, and therefore the title is Esse. And the poem ends with, she got out at Raspail, I was left behind with the immensity of existing things, a sponge, suffering because it cannot saturate itself, a river, suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees. And I think that idea of restlessness, a moment, a spot of time, and the restlessness that comes because of my inability, actually, and which makes it even more present when I write in non-native language. I have this the feeling of insufficiency, you know, rooted in a sense, or with me. But this idea is very Christian for me, you know, this idea that there is presence and we're trying to get there. And that's our mission, and it's very, you know what I mean? Like, so we're trying to touch the essence of things because we want this kind of, you know, what Hopkins meant by thisness, you know, going after Duns Scotus, you know, this idea, catch this through inscape or in stress, you know, but catch something, and we fail, we get up, we fail again, you know, then we get up again, we have a moment of maybe little kind of what we consider success, but maybe really not, you know, but we get maybe sometimes closer to the bark of a tree. But another thing, Stephen, so that's for me is my Christian experience. I mean, I could talk about Christian themes in my poetry because they pop up, right? Or the fact that, you know, in like my recent book in English, the last book of Annunciations, tries to map the moment of Annunciation onto current migration crisis. So that kind of extrapolation is important for me, to see Annunciation in our daily life. A poem that comes to my mind that is both for me Christian and this idea of givenness that I could actually read. It's a short poem. And it's a moment of when word becomes flesh, but it's a moment of like this, you know, we live, we meet people, and there is a moment of encounter, and we don't even know what will come of it. Just like we don't understand suffering, and we don't understand why we meet specific people, even if they hurt us or if they are delightful, or why Christ gives us specific suffering, this or not the other. And sometimes we wonder, is it from Christ or is it from the evil one? And, you know, we always have this question, right? Does Christ choose, I always have this question, does Christ choose suffering for me? And I believe so, but it's a very complicated question. So I wanted to read that poem, but it's a poem that simply revolves around the moment of ginkgo leaves. And it's a poem very much rooted in initiated by experience. So it's a poem I wrote many years ago, actually. I was going to New York to visit my mother, who is still there. She's in Poland right now. And I was disturbed by that visit. I was anxious. You know, my relationship was at that point anxious with my mother. And I was stopping by in Boston. I was driving to New York, stopping by in Boston, and a friend just gave me a ginkgo leaf and said, this is the last thing that my mom gave me before she died. when I arrived in New York, my attention, while walking with my mother in the park and going to the bank, my attention was completely overtaken by golden ginkgos, and it completely transformed. It's a simple thing like that transformed my relationship, but it was like kairotic for me. Mm-hmm. And that really was worth becoming flesh. And I'll just read that poem, but it's this was the root of given. It was nothing I invented, nothing I wanted to write even. I didn't have an agenda, right? So that poem was actually given. Ginkgo leaves. Your mother gave you a ginkgo leaf before she died. 1,000-year inhabitant of the Permian Ocean growing inside us as we study the blueprints of waiting. My mother too is an entrapped ghost. Her head is full of yellow secrets. These leaves push me forward as I walk the Manhattan streets to meet her. I kneel and pick them. They become oars. My mother stoops in the park to collect the same leaves. In multitudes, we can only give what we received. These groves inside us. And I'll just stop. Hopefully I made some sense, but for me, there are no Christian themes in that poem, but it is a Christian poem because for me it was this word becoming flesh. Mm-hmm. And that very often, that moment of friendship or encounter, even if actually I'm not friends with that person who gave me a ginkgo leaf, I admire that person, but we don't communicate, often. Yeah. But it was just this moment that transformed my relationship and recuperated something in my life where the ripples are still in effect, in a sense,
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great example too of a couple of things. In a way, it's a perfect example of the moment, right, where something becomes so riveting to you, and it seems like it's going to be, it can unfold, right? The ginkgo leaf is just like the green lizard or the orange. It's something that unfolds and it invites this full entry into a complex of experiences that are far beyond the object itself, but it opens up into them. It serves as like a portal. But as you were talking earlier, Eva, I was also thinking about how what we're talking about here is not just a desire to capture something for ourselves, but it is to communicate that to somebody else. So I now will look at a ginkgo leaf for the rest of my life. I will see a ginkgo leaf in the light of that poem, right? And so, and to me, that's a beautiful act of Christian charity for the poet to infuse an object, one of the infinity, virtually -1 of objects in the world, right? There's so much out there, but you've infused that with meaning that I then take away into my next encounter with that thing or with something else entirely, but it resonates within me. So, and I think that's an important thing for us to be thinking about, because I realize I'm also deferring on answering your very good question, Stephen, so we'll come back to that in a second, but I think there's something about that, because we are, obviously we are inspired ourselves not to gain for ourselves, but we're inspired in order to bring somebody else into the beauty and the love that we've experienced. And hopefully, even with our own, inadequate abilities and linguistic resources and everything else, hopefully we're able to at least make a gesture that brings somebody else closer. And that brings them not only into some sort of fuller experience of the thing that we're talking about, but also with there's a community that is built up between the writer and the reader as well. So as you were reading that, Eva, I was thinking like that's kind of the ideal of Christian poetry in a lot of ways. We can talk about Christian poetry and what it can or can't explore. We can talk about the spiritual discernment, as you were bringing that up, which I think is important. And anytime you're going to be talking about inspirations, like, well, inspired by what, to what end and all of that. But I was also, it seems like maybe an appropriate time for me to share one of the pieces from the first section of Fetus. And in this, it's an encounter with a person, but it's not so different. And I'm exploring this idea very intentionally at this point, seeing in another person a greater spiritual reality than one might initially be able to perceive. So the backstory, and Stephen knows there's like a big backstory for this whole poem, but basically the second part of it is called colostrum, which is Latin for bee stings, and in it there are kind of like three friends who are having a conversation in the midst of the poem, but the poem at this point is centering on one of the friends who is a pregnant woman who is on her way taking a bus to her obstetrician's office for the first time. And when she gets onto the bus at the end of the first section, the second section opens up with her realizing there was a nursing mother next to her. And so the mother has a child, and the mother is from India, or is Indian American maybe, and has a sari on and so forth. But the second section kind of culminates in this vision of our Blessed Mother. And we had some friends when I was thinking about this. I was remembering very much some very good friends of ours from Seattle. And they had a great devotion to Our Lady of Valankani, Our Lady of Good Health. So so Priya and Preeti were kind of in the background here. So this is after for a long time, and I should mention that on the bus, you don't look at other people. It's very rude to like turn around and actually look at other people. So the whole time, this pregnant woman who's curious about this other woman who's nursing across the aisle, but she feels like she can't look at her. She feels like it's going to be somehow rude or breaking some sort of unwritten code of mass transit. And so finally, without even really meaning to, toward the end of this longish section, she just turns and finds herself looking at her, and the woman is looking back. And so this is what happens when she looks at her, and she sees her in an earlier section, and she describes her. But then this is part 15 of Colostrum. A sunlit coastal landscape. Oh, and I should mention I'll interrupt myself a couple of times because the woman's friends sometimes interject things. And so I'll just raise a hand when one of them is speaking. A sunlit coastal landscape is in her look enclosed as well. We're on the other side of the border now. Ice plant climbs a limestone escarpment. Fruit trees organized by leaf shape wave, as synchronized swimmers do, to faint orchestral accompaniment. Sky filled us without fear. Your thoughts at most a turbid rill near her look's dusked perimeter. A sleepiest creek being overstepped and fished by sand cranes. Stressing over stressed pebbles and ultrasounds, infused with rippling tones of spikiest saffron. Your current hears futuristic trees shape verses unannounced through a semantic gaze. And this is the next section. No, newest nursling in my fold, the worst still comes. Only by being policed by prisoners and cavity searched by slaves and led toward inexhaustible pain will you be, as I am, sourced in Christ. Only if cries you suppressed in childhood are found and loosed sunward because you bear both sun and ward. Only if nihilists rip clouds apart and shove your bruised body inside will your diseased rain cool, as mine does, the thirst of Christ. Only by being crushed by stone-shoed pilgrims, sacrificed at roadside shrines to Baal or Ashtaroth, or some other nothing, will your gift be, as mine is, raised to Christ. Am I not here, I who am your mother? Nursling, approach the chastised one. Make his mutilations bee stings, nothing more as I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's beautiful, profound. I actually need a copy of that poem because I want to study it. Because I love, in that you have this presence there of the woman that stood out to me, right? That is like this invisible woman within the woman speaking, but also you have I wrote something like spiked saffron and some, you have many layers there that are just, I love the density, your imagination, like surreal trees. So it's unbelievable. Yeah, I want to read it. Can you send it to me, Steve?
Of course.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and that layering is one of the things that for me was was interesting. But I think that actually corresponds with my own experience of the world and then trying to translate it into poetry. And it's so easy, like if I see another person, my gaze of that into that other person, or my apprehension of that person's reality is enhanced if I see them as more than simply a sense perceptible being, right? If I see within them their intellect and their emotional affectivity, their soul, their longings, their experiences, all of these complicated and rich layers that are in them, and then recognizing that because I am called to live as a brother for this person that I'm encountering, I'm called to love them as a fellow child of God, then I see in them Christ. And when I see in them Christ, right, that opens up in this whole other way, and they become universal. They transcend themselves, and I then have to respond to just simply encountering a human being becomes an opening into it's not the universe, it's not divinity, it's like it's something so far beyond itself, it's something that's so expansive. And so that was why for me, as the woman is being looked at, and obviously there's the pietà there, right? She's holding her child, but but then she's very much Mary, but not just the nursing mother, because the woman in the poem is it's kind of her own passion. She's carrying her cross in her own way because the pregnancy is difficult for her. So anyway, so that woman becomes Mary, but then Mary also contains the garden within her. And so I was trying to just kind of figure out all these different facets as I held that moment up to the light. It made all the sense in the world to keep compounding that effect. So yeah, so I appreciate hearing that, Eva, because it seems like it maybe got at what it was trying to do.
And I also thought, that quick association I had was with tenderness of gaze, that it happens through the gaze that transcends, just voyeuristic kind of curiosity. That's why there is a response, from the other person. And it makes me think of Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian filmmaker, recalling a moment or speaking about this moment of being very tired, fatigued in some kind of subway, and there is a moment of this gaze. Someone looks at you in such a way that you have this moment of being, of transcending your humanity, of understanding something larger, a presence. It's a moment of being loved too, because this tenderness is, as you said, is going beyond just this sensory, this moment in time. It embraces much more. It embraces your history. So I love that.
And in the poem, the woman is being gazed at. Well, there's, I guess, a mutual gaze. They're gazing at each other. But I also think what you're describing there, Eva, that is exactly what we as poets are called to have as we go out into the world. We're called to have that gaze of tenderness. And regardless of whoever reads our work, right? Regardless of how successful it is by some sort of literary world measure, or in terms of cultural influence, if we go into the world and thanks to our taking up of our vocation to be poets for our Lord, if we go into the world with that gaze of tenderness, and we bring that moment that you're describing Tarkovsky having there, if we bring that to others, if we even bring that not even to other people, but just to everything that we encounter, I feel like we have absolutely done what we're called to do.
One question I had to do with what writers you look to help you understand better, or see better, or in some way apprehend more clearly the connections between. This is kind of going back to what Michael Edwards had talked about, but the connections between poetry and this playing out of God's work of redemption, because it's such a mysterious and so often invisible thing that kind of comes out to us in moments we catch a glimpse of this redemption happening, and often in very surprising ways, or someone who we've known for a long time, and we suddenly notice that, oh, they're different from how they were 5 years ago, or I hadn't even noticed that, something like that. There's something changing. There's yeah, really a movement toward this greater presence of Christ, and you're seeing it happen. Um, and it's not probably necessarily a very popular topic in a lot of especially, I guess, contemporary, modern contemporary work. But is there anybody that you can tell us about? I mean, you've talked about Miłosz, and I think that'll be a great a great takeaway for a lot of people watching this who aren't familiar with him, but he has so many wonderful poems and things that he's said, and he is clearly a modern a modern person who's engaging with these things. But yeah, I don't want to limit it to just modern or contemporary. I mean, any who do you like to read to get a glimpse of some of these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I remember when you were talking to Michael Edwards, and he was, and I can't remember exactly how it had come up, but he was saying, "Oh, I don't really know how many other people really think about these things."
Yeah.
At one point, and you and I, Stephen, when we were talking on the phone, I had said, "Yeah, I think these are absolutely fascinating and totally critical questions for anyone who's going to be writing poetry." And I remember actually saying this when I think it was at the first Pittsburgh encounter years ago. It was when we were doing kind of a Q&A after we'd all you'd read your Ammons piece, and Ava, you read some poems. So yeah, this is kind of a reunion, I guess. It's like a 11-year reunion or something. But I remember somebody asking, maybe just a general question about faith and poetry, and I was just saying, I said what came to mind, but I feel like the field has largely been abandoned. Like as if there's nothing more to do there, or it's kind of irrelevant, and that's not, I'm not speaking of, this isn't like absolutely across the board, but to me, I feel like there's so much for us, especially given what we grapple with as individuals in America today, what we grapple with as a society. I feel like these are really important questions, and they're fascinating ones, and I am surprised by the general disinterest. And the fact that this used to be really, really important, like I was just teaching one of my classes, King Lear, recently, and I mean, I love teaching that as, kind of what everybody else would teach it as. Here we have this old way of being, and we have a new way of being coming into collision. And the only way through is through, right? And it's going to be, but there's that moment where Lear and Cordelia are embracing each other at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 3. And he says, well, the way to prison will sing like two birds at the cage. Like, whatever they do to us, they cannot overcome us because we love. And our love is more powerful than anything that they can do. And so, despite...
And we'll forgive one another too.
Yes, yes. And yeah, he's going to ask for her blessing, like all of these. But it's so moving. Every single time I teach that, I'm on the verge of tears the whole time reading through that speech. I think it's so beautiful. And so we might think of Shakespeare as, being kind of more secular than religious. But again, I don't think that the terms are really adequate there. I think essentially he's got profound spiritual concerns. And if you read his plays with that in mind, there's a tremendous amount to be gained from them. And obviously he's writing like on the heels of this long tradition where Christianity has been just an integral part of poetic expression for a really long time. Again, not to say there wasn't ever any secular poetry, or there weren't madrigals being written, but you get my point. So the fact that today we have a world that is so clearly in starvation mode, spiritually speaking, and yet so few people turn to this with any sort of like, at least as far as I'm seeing, like a genuine interest or commitment. The ones who do, I think, are fascinating. And so Les Murray comes to mind, the great Australian poet. Like I love Les Murray. I'm fascinated by figures like Dunstan Thompson, right? So who kind of converts and kind of has to grapple with his previous poetry, which had been very popular, and suddenly he becomes unpopular. John Berryman has always been one of my favorite poets ever since I was young, and I didn't really care about much other poetry, but there was something about the voice that he was cultivating, even in his earlier poetry, certainly in the dream songs, but then also afterward when he begins writing this, I guess you could say it's religious poetry. It's certainly religiously inflected, but there's something about it where it's like, it's not as good as his other poetry by a lot of measures, but there's something about like the ragged man standing honestly with all of his gifts and all of his ability, and he kind of sets that to the side and he just speaks from this place of like kind of desolation, but also joy. So there's something about those figures, like Christopher Smart is an older one. Like, it's not just like My Cat Jeffrey, like you read Jubilate Agna, and like it's this incredible piece. Like but he's writing that when he's got some severe of mental health issues, and so I guess I'm always interested in these people who are kind of like they're no longer I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it James Adam Schuyler? Thanks to Hamilton, I'm now realizing that calling him James Schuyler might be wrong, but so from the New York school. But we were reading the Payne Whitney poems that he wrote when he was in a mental hospital as well, and they are so different from his earlier work, but they're also so beautiful. There's something about the raw immediacy of them, the fact that he's not trying to present this kind of clever persona to the world. So I guess I'm saying a lot of different things at once, but I'm of course interested in poets who actually bring spiritual concerns to the fore, either in terms of what drives their poetry or in the poetry itself. But I'm also interested in people being really, truly themselves. People who aren't cultivating a public persona, but who are speaking, kind of like putting that off to the side, if only temporarily, and saying something that feels very real. Like, it's like Keats's This Living Hand, right? Right, that might just be marginalia on the cap and bells, but there's something about it that's so incredibly powerful, and it feels like it's his heart, and he's opening it up, as terrifying as that poem is, right? But he's saying, hey, come on in for a second. That it can be bracing, it can be socially awkward, it can be pretty unpopular because that's not what people have often looked to poetry for. But that's what I personally am most interested in. I want what's human, and I'm not particularly interested in someone who's cultivating, a really careful appearance, who's like trying to be an influencer on some level, like whatever. That's not what poetry's about at its best for me.
Yeah, Ewa?
Well, I just, listening also to Steve, I had two thoughts that there are so many poets, but actually Flannery O'Connor, a fiction writer, came to my mind, and this idea of sense of mystery deepened by the contact with reality, which is, I think, quote from actually her essays, that her describing what is writing, right? Sense of, and I just, when I teach, good country people, and when I try to reenact it with my students, because I always want them to read, because it's so funny. But when they are in the barn, and the Hulga's wooden leg, and she wasn't Hulga, right? She was Mary somebody, she had a beautiful name before she renamed herself to Hulga. And then the wooden leg got stolen by a guy that she means to seduce, but instead he actually seduces her by, caressing her wooden leg. And the fact that Flannery O'Connor wanted this wooden leg to speak about our spiritual kind of deficiency, right? That we have this wooden leg in us, right? I just find it beautiful that she, in every story, starting with, of course, A Good Man is Hard to Find, there is this moment of violence, but not only it brings like a old grandmother back to who she was supposed to be, except she has to die to have that moment, right? To say, you are one of my babies. But the readers, by reading Flannery O'Connor, I become the grandmother, I become Hulga. So in a sense, we have this moment of redemption. That violence actually becomes a moment of grace for us too, so that she is in that sense a patron saint maybe of that redemption in time, even though it happens so drastically and by this very violent moment, right? And another writer I wanted to point to was actually a cousin of Czesław Miłosz, Lithuanian writer, poet, mostly poet and playwright, Oskar Miłosz, and you might have read Miguel Mañara.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Steve, have you read Miguel Mañara? Oh, I think you'll love it actually. And so that I'll tell you very briefly just why I think it is about this redemptive writing. So Oskar Miłosz was from a very wounded background, and he actually tried to kill himself, but the pistol didn't fire. And his family was mad. Mom was overbearing, the father was, some critics think his father was a seducer, but it's just pure poetry reading about those lives. His father would have such a fantasy that instead of horses he would catch black bears to take him to church or to market, put the trolley behind
Riding on a black bear.
Oh yeah, or create a balloon, and the village girls had to help him to create a balloon, and then the whole balloon would collapse, right? And so he was raised in total madness and paranoia. Actually, the father at a certain point developed paranoia and had to hide in the house. But he lived in Paris, and he was very much, a contemporary of Oscar Wilde and some French symbolists, but he very much thought that they were wrong about poetry because they didn't like this idea of middle class, of bourgeoisie, and they actually became very hermetic writers. French, that's what he claimed. French symbolists didn't really care about being understood. Mm. And Czesław Miłosz, actually, in his defense of poetry, claims that the academic poetry came from that line of French symbolism. And so Oskar Miłosz actually believed in eschatological poetry. And I think the fulcrum of that belief is in Miguel Mañara, which is fascinating because Miguel Mañara was a real person, I think in 17th century. So it's based on historical person, and it was a boy who went to the theater, if I remember well, to see some kind of version of Don Juan, a seducer, and decides, just like Oscar Wilde would have it, decides to imitate the art and becomes a seducer. And it's a wretched, wretched life. But what is brilliant about Miguel Mañara is that if you look at Mozart's version and all sorts of Don Juans, they usually go to hell. And in Miguel Mañara, the character, meets Girolama, a girl, and it's this moment of redemption because it's a moment of grace because his mother who died was called Girolama. And the girl is very innocent, but also understands what is the secret of sacrament. So doesn't reject him, but embraces him with all the wretchedness. And then when she dies very early in the marriage. He goes to monastery. And it's an absolutely beautiful, the fact that there is redemption in the most wretched of the circumstances. And Oskar Miłosz really was, how to say, had a novel perspective, talking about forgiveness and talking about that moment of redemption that comes through an encounter. So I don't know if I answered the question, but he came to my mind. And it's pure poetry, by the way. And the life of Oskar Miłosz was pure poetry. Oscar Wilde actually called him poetry itself. And he died, I have to tell you, because it's a beautiful thing for me, because I'm writing about birds right now. He died trying to chase his favorite canary who escaped from the cage and he tripped over. So imagine a guy who was trying to kill himself and didn't work out. And then died so beautifully, actually, looking into beauty, into the face of beauty, right? So anyway, I just thought these two things. And there are, I do wonder, Stephen, it's an interesting thing. I feel the field has been abandoned, but I think it's just like Holy Spirit is so brilliant because it infiltrates the writing nevertheless, like you were talking about Berryman, and I'm thinking about Fanny Howe and so many writers, Jory Graham, who would be absolutely probably not, maybe not Fanny Howe, but who would be maybe against, church as an institution, or they are not religious poets per se, but they have this grace and attention to redemptive moments, and it's just interesting how the Spirit works, and if we are truthful to the maybe to our sensibility even.
Loyal to our experience, and then we see. Yeah, that's great. Well, I don't know if I think we should probably draw to a close here. I'm going to try to say something that I feel is maybe, I don't know, one of the things I'm getting out of listening to you is that, okay, we started by talking about inspiration and what's given, and what's so interesting, and it seems to me, and what part of what's been said is that, you know, we just kind of on the face of it, those words inspiration and givenness, or the given, what is given, sound like, you know, being empty and receiving something to fulfill or to fill you up, or satiate, satisfy. But much of what you've been talking about, both of you, is the ways in which, I don't know, I want to say, like, the woundedness or the lack, or the misery, you know, the wretchedness, is made useful in some way, you know, not by necessarily having it go away or the suffering go away, but to receive, in some sense, a gaze that, you know, authorizes you to embrace it, and that's just a whole. I mean, I think, you know, Steve, you mentioned the cross and poetry and the cross, and I think, I mean, in many ways, what you're talking about is, like, in this realm, and this kind of givenness is that sort of thing. So thank you very much. I think that really added a very useful viewpoint. You know, the title at the title overall for this, that I made up, and I did not ask anybody's opinion on. So, but it started with a line from Paul Claudel's fifth of his Cinq Grands Odes, the fifth ode, and in translation it reads, "Through my mouth deliver this earth of the praise it owes you," and that can take so many forms. That delivering. So I really want to thank you for really bringing to light this, you know, these further dimensions. Really useful, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's been such a joy talking to you guys. It's really.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
Our conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.